Thank you so much, Avery. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Susanna, for the beautiful prayer, as well as for opening up for us and always reminding us of the reason, the why that we're here together. I have the distinct honor of being able to introduce and be able to have conversation with two people who I greatly admire. They are thought leaders in this space. And I'm going to begin by introducing Queen Quet, one of our panelists, and then introducing Dr. Junia Howell. The Queen Quet is a published author, computer scientist, lecturer, mathematician, environmental justice advocate, environmentalist, among many other things. She is the founder of the advocacy organization for the continuation of the Gullah Geechee culture, the Gullah Geechee Sea Island Coalition. Queen Quet is known throughout the world. She was actually the first Gullah Geechee person to speak on behalf of her people before the United Nations. Queen Quet was also inducted into the Gullah Geechee Hall of Fame, one of the first of 7 inductees. She's also been inducted into other halls of fame in the state of South Carolina, as well as other parts of the world. I am, again, honored to be here with Queen Quet today. I also want to introduce Dr. Junia Howell. She is an urban sociologist and race scholar whose work identifies housing and disaster relief policies, processes, and practices that uphold white supremacy. Her research is widely cited in news media, legislative hearings, and federal and local bills. Dr. Howell is currently at the University of Illinois, Chicago. She received her PhD from Rice University. I have the distinct pleasure again of hearing one of her recent talks, and I'm very excited about what she'll share with us tonight. At this time, I would like to offer Dr. Junia Howell the floor.
Got to unmute myself. Thank you so much for that generous introduction. And it is such a great pleasure to be with you all today. I'm going to start with a slight technical note. As you see, I'm going to throw my slides behind me, which is a wonderful feature of Zoom, but it does create some glitches if you're chatting. So if you wouldn't mind, just pause on the chat. I love reading everything's going on, but when I'm talking to you, if you wouldn't mind pausing and be ready, I'm going to try to summarize about a decade of research and multiple different publications in only a couple minutes. So there's going to be a lot flying at you and a lot of visualizations come your way. So if you could pause the chat and focus in, that'd be great. So let's get started. So from really enormous, devastating hurricanes to the more recently well-known encompassing wildfires, to even the most recently kind of big thing that we've been talking about in our country of these seasonal floods, we can no longer deny that climate change is having enormous implications on our communities. Moreover, it is increasingly clear that those that are racially and socioeconomically marginalized experience extreme devastation and are left with much less after disasters. For many years, scholars and nonprofits have explained this inequality by simply suggesting that disasters reveal inequality. In other words, inequality is there, it's across the country, it's everywhere, and when disasters come, everyone just kind of loses. But because we can see it more now, because everyone's lost, we reveal or we understand that this inequality is here. This perspective leads to what I would call a compassionate response, and this desire to say, okay, these people need necessities, let's make sure they have them. Yet this notion that disasters are purely revealing inequality is not actually empirically substantiated. When I first started to recognize this inconsistency in the literature, again, this was several years ago now, I started to figure out, okay, well, how can we actually empirically see if that's happening? Specifically, could we actually compare people who are living across the country and experiencing the inequality that is just vast in our country, but compare them across if they've experienced disasters or not, and see how that might be impacting the implications. So to do this, I use, and this is again, a series of different papers that I'm summarizing quickly here, but I use a random sample of the entire US in order to be able to compare people who are really similar on demographics. They live in racially and socioeconomically similar places, but some have experienced disasters and others have not. Using this kind of statistical isolation, I've been able to examine people both across time, so over a decade, of observations is what I'm going to show you today, as well as those who move across the country, which is extremely important, especially when we're talking about climate change and disasters, because people move because of these things. I've also looked at this across all sorts of outcomes, and my work is fairly easy to access if you're interested in some other outcomes. But today I want to focus on wealth. And by wealth, I don't mean wealthy. I'm using the social science way of using this word, which is the can't say that word right now. The summing or the adding of all of one's assets. So your bank account, your property, if you have it, all those kind of things, minus one's debt. So anything from a mortgage to school loans, credit card debt, etc. So this kind of broad conception of wealth is so important because as a social scientist, we know it impacts everything else, your health, your well-being, your housing, all these kind of things. And so when we actually looked at this outcome for people who did and didn't experience disasters, we started to find some really surprising results. So first of all, just to even further clarify what I'm doing here, I'm comparing people who are really similar on all those things I kind of threw up demographic wise, but also they had the exact same wealth in 1999. So they're equally as rich, if you will. And some lived through a lot of disasters over the decade and some did not. And to our surprise, the first thing that we found is those who lived through disasters actually ended our time period with more money than their counterparts, so the same people that serve the same amount of wealth that didn't live through the disasters. In other words, the disasters themselves were making them wealthier. First of all, not what we would expect, definitely not what we expected as researchers, probably not what you expect as people who've lived and maybe have experienced others living through disasters. And so we want to know, well, how much and who is this happening for? So first of all, just like mathematically, we actually can create that baseline by saying, okay, the people who lived under quote unquote normal conditions, which we can question if that's normal aside in the discussion, but those who didn't live through disasters, how much wealth did their wealth increase by? We'll use that as our actual mathematical baseline. And then we'll say, okay, what's the difference? And once we find that difference, we can actually graph it and say the amount of inequality that's different is the amount or wealth that we can account towards the disaster itself, holding everything else constant. And again, as you might expect, this disaster wealth growing potential isn't the same for everyone. When we look across educational attainment, we see those who graduated from college have gained a lot more wealth then again, this baseline would be college educated people who are not living in disasters. So those who are college educated living through disasters are gaining wealth, and they're also gaining more wealth than their neighbors who are less educated. A similar story is true when we look across homeownership and renting. But when the story actually starts to get very interesting is when we look across race, particularly if we intersect race with other forms of socioeconomic inequality. And we see from this intersectional perspective, white privileged residents are actually gaining a lot of wealth. Again, this is more than their white privileged counterparts not living through disasters. So even comparing those two groups, but more importantly, those residents of color and particularly those who are also disadvantaged across other socioeconomic axes are losing wealth. Another way to visualize or think about this is to think about it over time. In this graph, what you see is the darker colors are the people who've lived through more disasters and their wealth is growing faster and more. Most surprising is that green line on the top, which is actually FEMA aid, which is suggesting that counties that receive more FEMA aid actually are making their white residents richer. Unfortunately, and was probably not surprising at this moment since I've shown you these other graphs, Black residents and other residents of color are experiencing the complete opposite. In other words, disasters and in particular FEMA aid is actually creating some of this inequality. It's not just revealing it, it's actually making it happen. Moreover, this is not just governmental aid, it's also nonprofit aid. Particularly, we examine this by looking at counties that both experience disasters. So now we're just looking at disasters. And we also hold constant some other things about non-disaster counties. But for conceptually right now, just think about comparing two areas that have experienced similar disasters, but some have a lot of nonprofits, a lot of churches, a lot of other religious communities, and others do not. And unfortunately, and very depressingly, we find that when communities have a lot of nonprofits, their poverty actually goes up. In other words, nonprofits and specifically faith-based groups that are focused on compassionate relief actually lead to increased levels of poverty after disasters than counties that have had the same amount of disaster and haven't had those reliefs. So why is this the case? Obviously, this is super multifaceted and there's lots of components. And I'm happy to share more of the specifics that we've found in our research in the question and answer. But I want to posit for you today that one of the key reasons that this is the case is because our focus on compassionate relief without advocating for larger change is reifying the same notions that have created the inequality in the first place. Oftentimes, we think about all of these components, particularly from a religious perspective and from a Christian perspective as compassionate relief versus transformation. And to be clear, both are called for in communities of faith, and both are really important. But I would argue that in the American church, we're much more comfortable staying in our compassionate bubble and making sure that we're getting to people who we think are the most disadvantaged by the situations we see, instead of actually advocating to transform the principalities and powers, if you will, that are perpetuating these very inequalities. So with that, I will pass it off and we can get more into some of these details during the question and answer.
Wow. I would not have thought that was the case, that aid from our nonprofit organizations and from our government agencies are exacerbating and actually creating inequities. And Queen Quet, who I'm again honored to have here, she's also one of South Carolina Interfaith Prayer and Light's Leadership Council members, and we appreciate the context that she's able to provide for the work that we're doing here in South Carolina. But now, Queen Quet, we would love to hear from you about what is really happening on the ground.
Oh, Susanna, oh, don't you cry for me. I did punish your rich shore of the Gullah Geechee. That why yet it is now. When I've been a think about back yonder, when I yet fuss that old Susanna, and it cracky teeth but this your man had this your banjo. He had him put his knee in a journey, yeah. This your place, some called Old Alabama. I first yet it this year. The way plenty of 100 children probably yet him. Pun the cartoon. He been a bunny, been a sham. He been a singer. Oh, Susanna, oh, don't you cry for me. I come from Alabama with a banjo on my knee. But he ain't been to say why he left Alabama. But this year evening, when I get it this year from the doctor, I study about that thing. And I say, well, if it come all the way back young from Alabama, where some of the Gullah Geechee been walk across right for the Civil War, where some 100 children know we had about in the Gullah Geechee Nation, so when big shoot been a start. Some we family, where the Gullah Geechee still did it in the Gulf Coast, Alabama be, where New Orleans be. With this time of year, we start to remember about Katrina and the family were there in New Orleans. So that man who when I sing up that song, him and I sing about New Orleans, him and I sing about Louisiana, that he been a going if look for this song. But by the time we get to, they tell him, but don't cry. Tell Susanna, don't cry tall. Cause look, they had still a banjo. So that means it still had ability for sing, for have a song in the heart. But I study about that while the doctor been a cracky teeth soul. And I said, but what about we? When all of this your calamity and thing, what a human and thing, what an Anthropocene then tell we, they're going on. We gonna sing. Well, we say that don't cry for we, if all we behind left, when a banjo pun we need. I study about that thing. And I said, maybe for some of we. Oh, but what about we in this your line of the Gullah Geechee? They're showing just not one to graph and thing like that. Now the rest of people who know cracking teeth like Alecia, but yet me when I talk like this, when I'm putting on my mathematical hat, the way they taught us to in the university, graphs were a major part of that. Calculations, data. What is the cost that we are adding up as we think about the racial injustices that continue even during these times of calamity? Many of us who look at the word justice as what its origin point was, just us, the people that are now referred to as BIPOC and underserved and underrepresented, many times we see that word as just us because we're the only ones that tend to be suffering under various circumstances for which people are now calling for justice, whether that's economics or environmental. And as we just saw, the environmental impacts are economic. There is math behind it and math that's accumulating, but on what side of the graph, on what axis is it being accumulated? And on what axis is it being diminished? So as a native Gullah Geechee person whose ancestors are both Native American and African, that still resides on the Sea Islands here in South Carolina, we have been called resilient people as Gullah Geechees because we've still continued to maintain our cultural communities from Jacksonville, North Carolina to Jacksonville, Florida, and especially on the South Carolina Sea Islands, where many call this region the Low Country. Not because we're low in spirit, we're like that man that didn't want you to cry for him, but because of the ecology of the region. Unfortunately, statistically, the low also applies to income. So when we talk about wealth creation or wealth maintenance in the Gullah Geechee Nation, we've been blessed that many of our ancestors had what we say the Marawit for hold upon the land. That during the US Civil War, many of our ancestors purchased land that we live on today. But there is a continuous battle to hold on to it and to have the strength and the wherewithal and the resilience to not only now contend with those who are doing land grabs and want to overbuild on the coast, hence causing more environmental harms to the Southeast, but also because the intensity of the hurricane season, the intensity of the tropical storms, the intensity of the flooding, the diminishing of the ocean's capacity to stay stable and not be acidified, are all things that now we have to look at scientifically. And there is a cost that we must add up. But if we don't have residual income to invest in the environmental protective materials that can help restore and create more capacity of environmental resilience, then what happens to the coast? What happens to cultural heritage communities, especially those that look like me? One of the things that was intriguing to me is that while I listened and I waited after Susanna did her introduction, I thought back to where did I first hear the song that bore her name? I heard it from a bunny singing, if you didn't understand it when I said that in Gullah Geechee. I heard it from Bugs Bunny, like many of you did. Elmer Fudd singing. But guess what people have taught me over the years? And I come from a family of hunters and fishers and quilters and castanet makers and boat builders. They say ain't no fun when the rabbit got the gun. So now what are our animals trying to tell us and teach us as they migrate, looking for new habitats? What are they telling us as they eat the food that we as farmers plant for ourselves that now threaten our food security? Maybe we need to listen to them, hear them sing, and not simply sit around crying. Maybe it's time to put down the banjo because maybe we're playing it too loud that we cannot hear our mother speaking, Mother Earth, that nourishes and feeds us all, no matter what race and no matter what kind of creature you may be. So many times I've been in situations and groups like this in person and seeing what other races of people do when we start to talk about tenuous situations, things such as the climate changing, the world evolving in not a good way. Race comes into it, and as soon as it does, someone starts to cry. And it's usually not a Black person. It's not an Indigenous person. It's not a person of color. And I found myself saying, if you're crying, how do you think I feel? How do you think my whole community feels when the storms hit? Everybody else evacuates. Everybody else closes down the stores. And who is left? Who was always there? Just us. So I hope that now we will not have the ice part on there, Justice has that ice on there, not cool our hearts and ice our spirits to one another, but actually let them melt down in a way that brings in more than compassion, that gives a flow, that helps to level off the pH values so that the ocean is pure again. It's the way God meant it to be, in such a way that we can go out into it the way that we've done for generation after generation since the 1500s here on these sea islands, and cleanse ourselves, cleanse our souls, come forward and be transformed by the renewing of our minds so that we can sit and dialogue without the tears, but with the sober minds that truly want to discuss from the heart and the soul the value of sustaining everyone's culture, and not simply wanting mine to disappear somewhere in the flood, as long as you have photographs of us, video and audio recordings that can be museumized, that can be placed on kiosks along the coast, while we could be here on the coast, still living, still sharing our traditional ecological knowledge that brings balance, that helps the world know how and why we are so resilient. Let's talk about that word, justice. Let it not just be us in it. Let it be restorative to all souls, all communities, all cultures, all heritages, including the environmental justice that brings a balance for all the creatures. And maybe we all can sing together and sustain what we have, not be the one left where calamity has come and all you have left is a banjo on your knee, but hopefully somewhere within your soul, there might still be a song ultimately. So tonight, when I looked at our topic and saw racial justice, recovery, resilience, and restoration, I joined in because I pray that we can recover that which God would want us to have, that allows us to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. And so now we'd love to open up this circle to all of you and engage in a dialogue that'll be reaffirming to every soul herein too. So truly, Susanna, I pray that you don't have to cry for me and that you don't have to weep. As scripture says, biblically, Jesus wept. And we know that my ancestors and many others are probably weeping right now. And that's what we're calling rain that's causing the floods. So may we dry their tears as we sit together and sing some new songs that are uplifting, restorative, and that as we sing, it won't be just us, but the whole world, because we're all renewed and transformed too.
Thank you so much, Queen Quet. Those words were powerful and really do bring us to an opportunity to, you often talk about destruction that's happening along the coast. And today we're really bringing up, as you mentioned, the math that also goes into what's happening when the policies that are created based on white supremacy are in practice and in place. And we continue to do the same thing without stopping and renewing our mind while crying and bringing forward compassionate care by coming in to help after disaster is good. It's not enough. It's not justice. So I want to ask, beginning with you, Queen Quet, and then Dr. Howell, would like to hear from you too. What tools and what frameworks do you think that your faith tradition, that other faith traditions provide us to pushing back against, as Dr. Howell said, the principalities, those ecological and social injustices that are in place?
Well, as soon as you said that, and you said with faith, the first thing that came to mind was a story of, or one might say the scripture that refers to the fact that if a person doesn't have a coat and they come to you and they're saying they're cold, it does you no good to tell them does them no good for you to say, I'm going to pray for you to get a coat, and you're wearing a coat and a jacket and a vest. No, what you need to do is take off one of those and give it to that person. It does me no good if I say to you, I am hungry, and you have a 4-course meal, and dessert is on the way coming out of the kitchen and everything, and you don't even try to order something for me or say, here's some of what I have to eat, so that you don't have to starve. You tell me again, I'll pray for you to have a meal. That does not work. So when we come down to policies, or we come from compassion to transformation, we have to transform the way in which we act as individuals, and then collectively as community. And I mean global community, not being reactionary, but actually being active, all right, at all times, because being reactionary is what we get already. That's where the compassion comes. Oh my God. Oh, the media has this community. Oh my God, the storm hit them. Oh Lord, look at it, look at it. And now we become these looky-loos who are on our phones, we're on our iPads, on the computer, looking at someone else's suffering. And there has actually created what we call an industry, tragedy tourism, where people want to go and visit areas where some tragedy has taken place. Charleston, South Carolina is a prime example of that. So we don't want money coming in from tragedy tourism. We want policies that are consistent about where resources are going to go. I live in Beaufort County, South Carolina, and I pointed this out numerous times. It does not benefit Hilton Head Island for buses to be sent there for evacuation, because the majority of people on Hilton Head own more than one vehicle. They can evacuate themselves. Why are you eliminating St. Helena Island, which statistically is predominantly Black, predominantly Gullah Geechee, is rural, and is supposed to be at or below the poverty level according to the median income? How do you not think, if you're the policymaker, that if we're going to send in resources to assist the community during the time of a disaster, we send it to that area, to St. Helena, not to the place that's quote unquote affluent? There's no logic in that. But somehow they look at what the doctor has shown, FEMA records, and because there's a lot of FEMA assistance that goes to the richer part of the county, they track everything policy-wise and go, oh, well, then that means during a storm, we also need to send more resources over there, instead of thinking, no, they have enough resources over there. Where are the areas that have been missed? And as a computer scientist and mathematician, I've talked about the fact that census records are not valid uses for this kind of work, because most people of color don't complete the census forms. And so that's a policy we shouldn't use. The policy we should use is engaging with the people, hearing what their needs are, and then taking action to meet those needs before the disaster. And so that we can be proactive and consistently active and not just reactionary.
Yeah, amen. Absolutely. I was here talking and I'm thinking about, it's always a hard thing for me, at least, to think, how do we respond from all faith communities, right? Which is nearly impossible. But I would say, if we're going to say something about all faith communities, they all profess that they are not God. There is an entity and a being that is God above and sovereign. And what that looks like and feels like and is obviously diverse and different. But I think that's extremely important when we're talking about these issues, because it is really easy to default into thinking that our governments or our empires have the best solutions, but recentering ourselves on very long historical traditions that are made over time with lots of people help us hear those voices that tell us, who are we missing, as the Queen just mentioned? What are we not seeing? And from my own religious tradition of Christianity and its connections to the Abrahamic religions more generally, I ground myself in the reminders that are throughout what I would call the Old Testament or the Abrahamic scriptures more broadly, as well as in the New Testament, of remembering that we must analyze ourselves first, and that we are very easily sucked up to the empire. There's the minor prophets over and over, like, look at yourselves, Israel, look at what you're doing, look at your own exploitation, fix that exploitation. And also, yeah, all these other people are also, all these other nations are also exploitative, but address your own desire to push the foreigner out, address the own reality that you have slaves, that you are impoverishing your own people, right? And that is so clear in what the Christian tradition calls the good news, right? This notion that Jesus is coming to revitalize and renew this idea that we have a king coming and a new earth that will be created, that is one that challenges the principalities and powers, as I said earlier, challenges the empire and is scary to the empire because it's not comfortable. It's not about just giving, although obviously we need to, right? We need to give coats and we need to give food, but it's not about that. It's actually about totally reshaping the entire empire and the entire way that works. And we live in a settler colonial empire that is a very much still an empire. And every story that I read, Revelation has been really speaking to me on this recently. Like, there are so many vivid examples of the empire in Revelation that are exactly what we see today and exactly how we're approaching this. And so using those long held traditions to help us recenter and see for ourselves how we are perpetuating the same notion of dominance, that we think we are God, that we can be the Tower of Babel, right? That we can control everything, instead of recognizing what is our role and how can we steward this creation and each other into a community of more justice and more love and mercy.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Howell and Queen Quet, and I really appreciate, because I think you are connecting really about, being proactive and listening to everyone. Sharing power is an important piece in the whole addressing the policies that aren't providing equitable outcomes for everyone. One of the attendees asked early on, and this was a question, I think that this person was surprised like I was, that nonprofits and faith organizations are contributing to these inequalities after disasters. Can you dive into that a little bit more? How is that happening?
Yeah,
Well,
absolutely.
Oh, both of us will dive in. It's okay, Doctor. I want to give people some homework. I guess it's the professor in me. There's a book that I'm completing now that's called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. And that book was put together to challenge the system that the doctor outlined, the empire, right? Even though scriptures say, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. So here it is, what Caesar is doing is what you're rendering to Caesar also controls what you do as a nonprofit. And we know that most of the faith-based community is nonprofit. They're nonprofit organizations, whether they're synagogues, they're churches, they're mosques, they're nonprofit organizations. And what bothers me about that is I often point out to people, I don't really want to be a part of anything that's not for profits. And that's whether it's a F or a PH. Okay, so what we need is more prophets with the PH that see these things, have the vision, and will speak about it. That what happens is you can easily then come and make a donation to that nonprofit and that be absorbed in administration and never reach the actual people with the resources they were supposed to receive. And that is a problem. Also, if you have more, one might say, radical folks that are willing to challenge the system, that want to do that, they don't want to step out because someone will say, well, you can't do certain things because of your nonprofit status. You can't engage in policy making and lobbying or any of those things that do affect and infect the policy and restructuring of the empire. Because if you do, guess what? We're going to pull your nonprofit status. So instead of truly being grassroots, then many people succumb to that. And it becomes a problem because now it becomes just a matter of let's write this grant or write this proposal, let's get money in. But how much are we really helping the people? How much are we really helping the communities? So that becomes a very trying situation. I think it's well outlined from a lot of perspectives in this book, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. Sorry to cut you off, Doc. We just, I guess, on that same wavelength that it just hit us both, and we wanted to get that answer in there.
Yeah, absolutely. Amen to all of that. And I will just add that I made that comment also based off of my empirical research, which again, I was referencing multiple different pieces, but this piece is on social capital. It's free on my website if you're interested in getting into the math side of it. But specifically how I can make that claim is, again, as I briefly explained, we are empirically comparing communities that do and don't have different levels of nonprofits. And so just like if you're doing a medical study, you want to test it out by giving someone a placebo, right? Versus like an actual drug or vaccine, as we've all been in the process of conversations recently. Social scientists do this often by comparing situations that are different. So it's our way of testing something in the real world. We're going to compare a place that has it and a place that doesn't have it. And so in that study, we're able to isolate that nonprofits, generally speaking, but actually specifically the worst offenders, if you will, are faith-based nonprofits. Which again, as a person of faith, I was actually working on this work with all people who aren't faith or aren't people of faith. And it's always a little like disheartening to be like, oh yes, this is real, right? Like, so I feel that, and I'm not saying that all nonprofits are bad, that we need to get rid of them. I'm not saying any of that, but I am saying that we know that on a big picture, to statistically, that's what's happening when they're present, and more granularly, I guess is how you would say that, as the Queen just referenced. There are many reasons for it. Some of it is because of administration and what can and can't get funded. Also, it has to do with networks, right? Where churches and other faith-based organizations are often not the places that have the most disadvantage because of the financial structure that there goes within. And then also, if you're thinking something like a hurricane or a big event like that, you have wealthy churches are going to help their parishioners first, right? And other, which is understandable. Like, we're human. We know someone's who just lost their roof, but it actually, we see a decrease in those nonprofits and churches and other communities of faith giving in those heightened moments, if they're also in there, if they're also in the moment, to other communities around them. So if they're not experiencing a disaster, that's a different story. But the ones that are there are giving towards their own networks, and because of segregation and inequality more broadly, and the church and other communities of faith are also that, it reflects all those same structures. So empirically, that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm claiming. There's more details there if you're curious, but also, again, just on a bigger theoretical reason, I think much of that comes from the ways in which we think about giving aid, as the Queen was just referencing. Instead of advocating for transformation or new policies or thinking about fundamentally what's going on here, our gut to just like, let's put a Band-Aid on this, often perpetuates a lot of and diminishes our pushback, right? Like, we know this historically. If we give money, then we feel less angry that we need to fix the whole system. We know this is how empires, and if I can, this is how capitalism persists, right? And if we, as Christians, and other people of faith, if we want to challenge that, we have to do more than enabling the kind of Band-Aid cycle that is often our default.
Understood. We have to do more. So Dr. Howell, I want to continue with another question for you, given I know both of you have done work on federal and local bills, specifically, I guess, Dr. Howell, and then Queen Quet, if you have want to add to this, from your experiences, what factors are the stronger obstacles to changing policy and addressing climate justice and the climate crisis? For example, is it the industry that's pushing back? Is it the politics? Are they the legal processes or other factors?
Mm.
Do you want me to go first? Or do you want to go first, Queen?
Go ahead, Doc.
Okay. Well, obviously, I mean, as a good academic, I'm going to say it's all the above, right? It's all these factors and more. We can't solely say it's one thing or another.
Mhm.
Personally, I would say that I have seen both a lack of radical imagination and an unwillingness to implement things that don't feel familiar as the key things that I've struggled with when I've been working very closely with both local and federal policy. To flesh that out slightly, that we are, I mean, this is probably true of all people, right? Like, it's easy to just tweak things within our comfort zone. Like, let's just add one regulation here, or let's give a little bit more money here. But when I'm like, okay, let's actually rethink all of land ownership and everything we think about how we maintain our Mother Earth, are these things that aren't just about physicality, but spiritual and other components, you know, that's when you get all the rails going up and they're like, whoa, 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 that's too much. That's too far. That's unpractical. That won't happen. So we can't even discuss it or imagine it. And similarly tied to that, even when I've offered very specific, can we add this box to this form levels of intervention, I have found a desire to have it tested out that's somewhere not the agency I'm talking to. So the number of times I've been talking to agencies, and this is across agencies I've worked with, which is a lot of different agencies at this point, I'll be like, you have this specific form, and if you changed it in this way, or you have this specific policy, if you added this thing, there's a high likelihood we would decrease some of these issues that we're seeing. And their gut response is always like, well, has someone tested that out for us? And I'm like, it is your form. So no, is my initial like reaction, right? But I'm starting to realize that they can get away with that. And so how do we creatively figure out, how do we test this out? Or how do we create other kinds of radical solutions that can come alongside and push back to that narrative that we always have to test it out if it's going to push towards equity, right? We don't have to test it out if industry and powers are there and are like, this is a better idea, like, great, we're done. But if it's new from a perspective that feels progressive to people, even if they consider themselves progressive, there's a lot of like, we need to test this, we need to know. And so those are the two things I've been really wrestling with recently in my advocacy.
Well, I'm on the other end of the spectrum, as academic as I may be, as a doctor, because people have told me before, you're no academic lightweight yourself, Queen Quet. But I'm on the other end of the spectrum in that I don't mind setting a precedent. Somebody has to be first. And I have run into exactly what the doctor said, dealing with academicians and politicians. It's always that. And like people say, you know, all politics are local, and they want to localize the issue down to the most minute detail. Like she said, the box on the form, not realizing this is your form. So it's a matter of editing. Just somebody in your office need to go back into the document and just put the box. You know, it becomes so convoluted and bureaucratic that nothing gets done. And that's what I think the world is frustrated with now, is that things that should have been done a long time ago, instead of taking action, people are still just talking. And it's all because someone's afraid to set the precedent. Having been vetted with the White House and doing something that was a first time ever in history, getting a congressional law passed to protect a group of Black people and their homeland. I came in the door going, so we can do this, and we can do this, and we can do this. This comes from vision. It doesn't come from looking at what somebody else did. If what somebody else did was working, we don't need to do it again. We already have wheels on a car. We don't need to invent wheels. So I'm sitting there frustrated, ready to pull out all my corkscrews, because I'm saying this is a first, meaning, do y'all realize we're the first? This is unprecedented. If we do this right, others will model what we do. And then individual fear factors of mostly people who worked in academic institutions backed up. People who worked in museums backed up. These people had been put on this group because of their credentials. Their credentials weren't their culture. And so they did not sit down at the table with the native Gullah Geechees and recognize the urgency of the moment. For us, it was literally life or death. The other people who are stuck in bureaucratic systems, it's not life or death, it's a paycheck, it's a position. So this policy doesn't necessarily do anything for them, but the next paper they write might give them tenure, or this might be a good blog or news article for them. But if you're the one living amidst the issue, it's personal. And that's the part that doesn't get recognized amidst the policies and the bureaucracy and the academic studies, is you're still dealing with human beings. And so if their lives are threatened, we should find that an urgent matter, not something that we have more months to study. Okay. And so Doc, I feel your pain. And I also feel it from a whole nother, or on a whole nother level, especially when it's racial. Because when we have done something that sets a precedent that no other Black people have done, that no other Indigenous people had done in this manner, you get all the questions. Was that okay? Would that be okay? Should we do that? And then everything just stops and people freeze. It's like talking about climate change. Some people just melt down and say, well, there's nothing we can do. I'm overwhelmed. I don't think I can do anything. And you have to bring it back to, yes, you can. Because if, just like this ocean behind me, it is a series of droplets. So think of yourself as just one droplet. But if you're going to be a healing droplet, we need you. And we need you to move, and we need you to flow. We sure don't need you to ice over. Like I mentioned earlier, we don't need you to freeze. We need you to move, and we all need to start to flow together. But we have to step out and be willing to be that voice, that person that will set the precedent.
Thank you so much, Queen Quet. And that really goes into the last question that I think we have time for. So one of the attendees asked about some other ways. What are the creative ways? And you spoke about this, Queen Quet, about stepping out and being the first to be able to speak on behalf of the Gullah Geechee people and creating the nation, and this being the first time that that was recognized in our country. So in closing, do you have any other thoughts about how we can all take that mantle? It's a life or death situation here that we're talking about. And you have outlined that. And certainly when you are in that position, you work and move with a lot more urgency maybe than other people do. But we know that many of us are in this space because we believe in working together for the common cause, whether it be our faith motivating us or another force that's motivating us to be here. So can you talk to us, and this will be the last question I think that we have time for, Queen Quet and then Dr. Howell, about what are some creative solutions that we can each take in our various roles to advance for justice, equity, resilience, and ultimately restoration?
Well, I know this won't shock you. It might shock some people in your audience. I don't believe everybody's a creative being in that sense. When we use the word creative, people start just thinking about artists. We're not talking about that. We're talking about just doing something different than, as the doctor said, might be in your comfort zone. Being willing to get out of the comfort zone. And I say, I don't think everybody's a creative being, because like they taught us in school, we have the right brain and the left brain, and some people operate more on one side or the other. So some people are very linear. I'm a mathematician and computer scientist, but y'all know I'll break out in a song in a heartbeat. So I work with both sides of my brain, but some people work on one side or the other better than they do on the other end. So if you know you're that linear person, you're that person that wants to put everything in a box, break the box. Get rid of the box. That would be your creativity. Break that box. And if you don't have the tools to break it, connect with some people who will constantly be your support system that says, nope, you revert You're reverting back to that linear thought. We got to do something different. You're reverting back to that bureaucratic thought. Let's do it differently and have a group of people that can be with you. That's what the faith communities are about. It's about us being the synagogue. It's about us being the church. It's about us being that embodiment of righteousness that moves around and walks around at all times. So we have to know that we can speak things into existence, much less we can put things into existence, that we can create the world we want. So in that sense, we all have that ability. So if you want a new world that's healed, where Mother Earth does not have to send us all to our rooms again like she did 2 years ago and tell us to sit down, then what we need to do is stop speaking in doom and gloom and speak in what we want. Don't speak about what you don't want, because you bring more of that into the world. Bring in the positive energy, bring in, yes, the love and the compassion, but let's bring it in a transformative way where we actually contribute to the benefit of Mother Earth, the benefit of each one of us as souls that are the living church, the living synagogue, the living spiritual institution, so that we can literally have churches without walls, because it'll be outside under those oak trees like my ancestors did in the bush arbor and the brush arbor, where they were singing and they didn't need no banjo to do it. They had their hands and their feet clapping and shouting and giving thanks for all that we have. And so I feel that's what we can do, is take what we already have. We ask, what's in your hand and what's spoken from your mouth?
Amen. I don't want to follow that, but really quickly, in a few sentences, I would echo everything that was just said and add that the prophetic voice we were talking about earlier too, that we can collectively be a prophetic voice, individually for some of us, and also together to speak back to those that are perpetuating the injustices, which sometimes is ourselves and our own institutions. So to think and look inward for the ways in which we can refine and improve, and also to speak to our governments, our other fellow believers or non-believers who are working in this space. That's big and bushy and not very specific. We don't have a lot of time at this moment to be specific, but I know that there's going to be more conversations. I know I'm someone who's all about what can we actually radically do to change things in specifics. And so connecting with each other and among different groups to really work towards that vision, and to use what we have, as the Queen said, to prophetically live in to a new world and a new creation that can and is being made.
Amen. So break open the box. We've got to step outside of that box, use what's in our hand to push back against the injustices. And sometimes those injustices are our own actions, and other times there are the injustices in our government that we have to find the voice. We have to find our voices to speak against. Thank you so much, Dr. Junia Howell. Thank you so much, Queen Quet.